Claire's fingers traced the edge of the dusty cardboard box, hesitating for just a moment before lifting the lid. The attic was stuffy, and sweat trickled down her neck as she sat cross-legged on the wooden floor. She had meant to snoop. She'd just been looking for Christmas decorations, but something about this unmarked box tucked behind a stack of old magazines caught her eye. The first photo she pulled out made her smile. It was Tom, younger but still handsome, standing in front of their house. But her smile faded as she pulled out the next one. Tom again, but this time with his arm around a woman Claire had never seen before. They were both dressed up, the woman in a stunning white dress, Tom in a tux. A wedding photo. Claire's heart started beating faster as she flipped through more pictures. The same woman appeared in all of them, a beautiful brunette with bright eyes and a confident smile. In one photo, she was laughing at something off-camera, her hand resting on Tom's chest. In another, they were cutting a wedding cake together, looking like the perfect couple. She turned one of the photos over, finding neat handwriting on the back. Tom and Rachel, wedding day 2012. Rachel. The name hit Claire like a punch to the gut. Tom had mentioned being married before, but he'd always been vague about it. It ended in divorce, he'd say with a dismissive wave of his hand whenever she asked. Ancient history. But something felt off. These photos didn't look like they belonged to a failed marriage that ended in divorce. They looked cherished, preserved, hidden away like secrets. Claire pulled out her phone, her hands shaking slightly as she typed Rachel's full name into Google. The results made her blood run cold. Local woman still missing after 10 years. The headline read. Claire clicked the link, her breath catching in her throat. The article showed a more recent photo of Rachel, the same woman from the wedding pictures, alongside details of her disappearance in 2013. The case was still unsolved. Claire sat back against a dusty box, her mind racing. Tom had never mentioned Rachel going missing. He'd never said anything about a police investigation. According to the article, Rachel had vanished without a trace, leaving behind her car, her phone, and all her belongings. The last person to see her? Her husband, Tom. Unable to stop herself, Claire dove deeper into her search. She found old social media posts from Rachel's family, begging for information about her disappearance. She found newspaper articles that painted a picture of a woman who'd had everything to live for, a successful career, close family ties, and no reason to just walk away from her life. Then she stumbled across something that made her stomach turn. An old business news article mentioned a fraud investigation at the company where Tom and Rachel had both worked. The investigation had been dropped shortly after Rachel's disappearance, but the timing nagged at Claire. She remembered the way Tom always changed the subject when she asked about his previous job. Claire's hands were trembling as she pulled up their bank's website. Tom had given her access to all their accounts when they got married, including some older ones he rarely used. She scrolled through years of statements, her heart pounding as she found what she was looking for, large transfers of money around the time Rachel disappeared. The attic suddenly felt too small, too close. Claire could hear Tom downstairs, probably making dinner like he did every Tuesday. The same Tom who cooked her favorite meals, who remembered every anniversary, who called her honey in that soft voice of his. Was he the same man who might have killed his first wife? She thought about all the little things that had never quite added up. The way he'd get defensive if she asked too many questions about his past. How he never wanted to visit certain parts of town. The locked filing cabinet in his home office that he said just contained boring old papers. Now those oddities felt less like quirks and more like warning signs. The sound of Tom's footsteps on the stairs made Claire jump. She quickly shoved the photos back in the box and buried it under the magazines. Her heart was racing as she grabbed a box of Christmas lights, her original excuse for being in the attic. "Find what you were looking for?" Tom called up. "Just about," Claire answered, amazed at how normal her voice sounded. But nothing felt normal anymore. She was living with a stranger, a man who might have murdered his first wife. And now she had to figure out what to do about it before she became his next victim. Claire barely slept that night. Every time Tom shifted in his sleep beside her, she tensed up, wondering if he could somehow sense what she'd discovered. The man she'd married, the one who just mumbled "love you" before drifting off, might be a killer. The thought made her stomach churn. She waited until Tom left for work the next morning before pulling out her laptop. Her hands hovered over the keyboard as doubts crept in. Maybe she was jumping to conclusions. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation for everything. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was living in a house built on lies. Opening an incognito browser window, something she'd never felt the need to do before, Claire started digging deeper into Rachel's case. Social media was full of posts from people who'd known her. Comments like, "She'd never just leave," and "Something happened to her," jumped out from the screen. Rachel's sister had maintained a Facebook page dedicated to finding her, posting regular updates even years after the disappearance. One post caught Claire's attention. Rachel's sister had written about a conversation she'd had with Rachel just days before she vanished. According to the post, Rachel had been nervous about something at work, saying she'd discovered irregularities in some accounts. She'd planned to report it to higher-ups that week. She never got the chance. Claire's phone buzzed with a text from Tom. "Meeting running late. Don't wait up for dinner." A normal message, the kind he'd sent hundreds of times before. But now it made her wonder about all the other late nights, all the times he'd been vague about where he was going or what he was doing. She found herself opening their shared photo album, scrolling through pictures of their life together. Their first date at that Italian restaurant downtown. The day they moved in together. Their wedding. Tom looked exactly the same in these photos as he did in the ones with Rachel. Same warm smile, same way of looking at the camera, like he had nothing to hide. A notification popped up on Claire's laptop. A reminder about their dinner plans with the neighbors this weekend. The thought of sitting across from Tom, making small talk and acting normal, made her feel sick. How many dinners had Rachel sat through, suspecting something was wrong but trying to keep up appearances? Claire jumped when the doorbell rang. Her heart raced until she remembered it was just Paula, their mail carrier, probably with another one of Tom's packages. He was always ordering things online, tools, books, electronics. She'd never thought much about it before, but now she wondered what else might be hiding in those innocent-looking brown boxes. After signing for the package, Claire stood in the kitchen, staring at their wedding photo on the fridge. She'd always loved how happy they looked in it. Now she couldn't help comparing it to the photo of Tom and Rachel she'd found in the attic. The same happiness, the same promise of a future together. What had happened to change that? She needed to talk to someone, but who? Her best friend Sarah would think she was crazy. Her mom would tell her to confront Tom directly. The police? What could she tell them? That she'd found some old photos and suspicious bank statements. That her husband's first wife had gone missing a decade ago, and she had a bad feeling about it? Claire grabbed her keys and drove to the local coffee shop, needing to get out of the house that suddenly felt full of secrets. As she sat with her latte, she opened her phone's notes app and started making a list of everything she knew for sure. Facts only, no speculation. It wasn't much, some old photos, weird timing with money transfers, and a missing person case that had gone cold years ago. The barista called out someone's name, Rachel, and Claire nearly jumped out of her skin. A teenage girl with bright pink hair collected her drink, completely unaware of the effect she'd had on the nervous woman in the corner. Claire realized she couldn't go on like this, jumping at shadows and second-guessing everything. She needed a plan. By the time she drove home, she'd made up her mind. She couldn't confront Tom. Not yet. If her suspicions were right, that would be too dangerous. But she couldn't just ignore what she'd found either. She needed proof one way or the other. She needed to know if she was living with a murderer. Claire started noticing things she'd overlooked before. The way Tom's jaw tightened whenever the local news mentioned cold cases. How he always changed the subject when mutual friends brought up their past relationships. The locked drawer in his desk that he'd said contained just old work stuff now felt like a treasure trove of potential evidence. She began keeping track of Tom's habits, something she'd never imagined doing to her own husband. He usually deleted his browser history. She'd noticed that while using his laptop to print something last month. His phone was always locked, and he never left it unattended. Normal privacy habits, maybe, but they felt different now. One evening, while Tom was in the shower, Claire found herself staring at his phone on the nightstand. The water would run for exactly 12 minutes. He was a creature of habit. With shaking hands, she picked up the phone. The password was their anniversary date, something she'd known but never needed to use before. Inside, she found nothing suspicious in his recent texts or emails, but there was a secure folder app that required a different password. The shower turned off, and Claire nearly dropped the phone getting it back in place. Tom came out wrapped in a towel, water dripping from his hair, and smiled at her. "Everything okay, honey? You look flushed." "Just tired," she said, amazed at how easily the lie came out. "Long day at work." That night, after Tom fell asleep, Claire lay awake thinking about Rachel's final days. Had she also noticed little things that didn't add up? Had she confronted Tom about the missing money? Claire remembered finding those old bank statements, showing large transfers right before Rachel disappeared. She needed to look at them again, but more carefully this time. The next day, Claire called in sick to work and waited for Tom to leave. As soon as his car pulled out of the driveway, she headed to the garage. The box of cleaning supplies that had caught her eye last week was still there, shoved behind Tom's workbench. The receipt taped to the side was dated the week Rachel went missing: industrial-strength cleaners, heavy-duty garbage bags, and a new set of tools. Her hands trembled as she moved boxes around, looking for anything else out of place. Behind an old paint can, she found a plastic bag wrapped in duct tape. Inside was a piece of fabric, cream-colored, delicate, with what looked like dried blood stains. Claire's stomach lurched as she realized it could be from Rachel's wedding dress. The sound of a car door slamming outside made Claire freeze. She quickly shoved everything back in place and rushed inside through the kitchen door. It was just the neighbor getting home early, but her heart wouldn't stop racing. She couldn't keep doing this alone. She needed help. With trembling fingers, she looked up Rachel's sister online. Karen Mitchell still lived in the same city, running a small bookstore downtown. Claire wrote down the address, then deleted her browser history. She was learning to be careful too. The bookstore was quiet when Claire walked in that afternoon. A woman who looked strikingly like Rachel was arranging books on a display table. The family resemblance was unmistakable, making Claire's chest tight. When Karen looked up, her smile was warm but tired, the smile of someone who'd carried grief for too long. "Can I help you find something?" Karen asked. Claire glanced around the empty store before speaking quietly. "I'm here about Rachel. I'm married to Tom." The smile vanished from Karen's face. She walked to the front door, flipped the sign to closed, and locked it. When she turned back to Claire, her eyes were sharp with a mix of suspicion and desperate hope. "Tell me everything," Karen said, leading Claire to a small office in the back. "And please start from the beginning." Karen's office was cramped, filled with boxes of unsold books and faded missing person posters. Claire recognized Rachel's smile from one of them, the same smile she'd seen in those wedding photos. Karen pulled up a chair and sat across from Claire, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I knew," Karen said quietly. "I knew he had something to do with it. The police said there wasn't enough evidence, that people leave their lives behind all the time. But Rachel would never." Her voice cracked. "She would never just disappear without telling me." Claire pulled out her phone and showed Karen the photos she'd taken of the bank statements. "These transfers happened the week before she disappeared. And I found something else." She described the blood-stained fabric in the garage, watching Karen's face grow pale. "We need to go to the police," Karen said, already reaching for her phone. "Wait," Claire grabbed her wrist. "Tom can't know I'm involved. If he figures out I'm investigating him..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Karen nodded, understanding written across her face. They spent hours going through Karen's files. She'd kept everything related to Rachel's disappearance. Police reports, newspaper clippings, printouts of emails Rachel had sent in her final weeks. One email caught Claire's attention. Rachel had written to Karen about finding irregularities in the company's accounts, mentioning that Tom had been acting strangely when she brought it up. She was going to report it, Karen said, her voice bitter. She had a meeting scheduled with the company's ethics board. The day after she disappeared. Detective Sarah Martinez listened carefully as Karen laid out the new evidence. Claire sat quietly beside her in the precinct's interview room, her heart pounding. She'd insisted on Karen making the initial contact with the police. It would be harder for Tom to trace it back to her that way. The case was never officially closed, Detective Martinez said, flipping through the old file. But without new evidence, our hands were tied. This blood-stained fabric you mentioned, can you get it to us? Claire nodded. I can go back when Tom's at work. But I need protection. If he finds out, we'll assign a surveillance team, Martinez assured her. But you'll need to act normal. Any change in routine could tip him off. That night, Claire packed a small bag and left it in her car's trunk. Karen had insisted she stay with her once they turned the evidence over to the police. You can't go home after that, she'd said. It won't be safe. The next day moved in slow motion. Claire went to work, answered emails, ate lunch with colleagues. Every phone call made her jump, expecting Tom to confront her. But he just sent his usual sweet texts, asking what she wanted for dinner. At 3 o'clock, she told her boss she had a dentist appointment. Instead, she drove home, knowing the police were watching the house. Tom's car wasn't in the driveway. He always worked late on Wednesdays. Her hands shook as she unlocked the garage door. The fabric was exactly where she'd left it. She put on latex gloves. Karen had thought of everything and carefully placed it in an evidence bag. As she turned to leave, she noticed something else behind the workbench, a small lockbox she'd never seen before. Claire hesitated, then grabbed it too. The police could get a warrant to open it. She was about to close everything up when she heard a car in the driveway. Tom's voice carried through the garage door. Claire? You home early? Her blood turned to ice. She wasn't supposed to be here. Neither was he. Claire's mind raced. The evidence bag felt like it was burning through her jacket pocket. She could hear Tom's footsteps coming around to the garage's side door. Your car's in the driveway, he called out. Everything okay? Claire shoved the lockbox behind some paint cans and grabbed a box of Christmas decorations from the shelf. The door opened just as she straightened up. Oh, hey. She managed to smile, hoping he couldn't hear her heart pounding. I was just grabbing some decorations. Thought we could surprise your mom when she visits next week. Tom stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Funny, I could have sworn those were in the attic. Some of them. Claire shrugged, trying to keep her voice steady. But I remembered seeing more out here. She took a step toward the door, but Tom didn't move. You've been acting strange lately, he said quietly. Distant. Is something bothering you? Claire felt the evidence bag crinkle as she shifted position. Just stressed about work. You know what's strange? Tom moved into the garage, letting the door close behind him. I got a call from Karen Mitchell today. Rachel's sister. First time in years. Said someone had been asking questions about Rachel. The temperature in the garage seemed to drop 20 degrees. Claire clutched the box tighter, her knuckles white against the cardboard. Tom, What's in your pocket, Claire? She looked at the door behind him, calculating. She could probably get past him if she ran, but the evidence would be lost. And if she was wrong about everything, she was about to destroy her marriage for nothing. But then Tom smiled, and it wasn't the warm smile she'd fallen in love with. It was cold, predatory. The smile of a man who'd done this before. I loved Rachel, you know, Tom said, taking another step forward. She was a lot like you, smart, curious. Too curious sometimes. Claire backed up until she hit the workbench. What happened to her, Tom? She couldn't leave well enough alone. Had to dig into everything, ask questions that weren't her business. He sighed almost sadly. I really hoped we wouldn't have to have this conversation, Claire. A sharp bang made them both jump. The garage's main door was rolling up, revealing 2 police officers with drawn weapons. Thomas Walker, one called out, "Step away from your wife and put your hands where we can see them." Tom's face contorted with rage. He lunged for Claire, but she was already moving, ducking under his grasp and sprinting for the door. She felt his fingers graze her jacket, heard fabric tear, but then strong hands were pulling her to safety. Detective Martinez appeared beside her as more officers swarmed the garage. Tom was on the ground, being handcuffed, his face pressed against the concrete. Are you okay? Martinez asked, leading Claire to a waiting car. We were watching the house. When he showed up early, we called for backup." Claire nodded, unable to speak. She pulled the evidence bag from her pocket with trembling hands. The fabric inside was still wrapped in its plastic, preserved like a time capsule of violence. "There's more," she managed to say. "A lockbox behind the paint cans. And in the attic." Tom's voice carried across the driveway as they led him to a police car. "Claire, don't do this. You don't understand." But she did understand. She understood perfectly now. She watched as they put him in the back of the patrol car, noticed how practiced he looked at ducking his head to avoid hitting it on the frame. Like he'd done it before. Karen arrived just as the police were stringing crime scene tape across the garage entrance. The sisters-in-law who had never met held each other and cried while evidence technicians began their careful documentation of Tom's hidden crimes. "Would you like me to continue with Section 6? The contents of Tom's lockbox told the story Rachel never got to tell. Inside were documents showing years of financial fraud, along with Rachel's handwritten notes about the discrepancies she'd found. There was also a small notebook, its pages filled with what looked like dates and locations. Detective Martinez feared they might be connected to other missing persons cases. Claire spent hours in the police station, going through everything they'd found. Her stomach turned as she recognized Tom's handwriting, the same writing that had left her loving notes on the kitchen counter every morning. "The blood on the fabric matches Rachel's DNA," Martinez told her one evening, sliding a report across the table. "We found more evidence when we searched the house. Traces in the garage that someone tried to clean up. Your husband was thorough, but not thorough enough." Claire stayed with Karen, neither woman wanting to be alone. They spent late nights talking about Rachel, about Tom, about all the signs they'd both missed. Karen showed Claire videos of Rachel from before, her wedding speech, family Christmas parties, backyard barbecues. The woman on the screen was so alive, so real, it made Claire's chest ache. "Did I ever really know him?" Claire asked one night, staring into her cold tea. "How could I live with someone for 2 years and not see what he was?" Karen reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "He fooled everyone, Claire. Even Rachel. That's what men like him do. They show you exactly what you want to see." The district attorney warned them the trial would be rough. Tom had hired an expensive defense team, and they'd try to paint Rachel's disappearance as a voluntary escape from a troubled marriage. They'd attack Claire's credibility, suggest she was a jealous second wife looking for attention. Claire spent weeks preparing for her testimony with the prosecutor, Sarah Chen. They went over every detail, when she found the photos, how she discovered the bank records, the confrontation in the garage. Chen warned her that Tom's lawyers would try to rattle her on the stand. "Just tell the truth," Chen advised. "Don't try to guess what they want to hear. Don't let them rush you. And remember, you're not the one on trial here." The media attention grew as the trial date approached. Local news vans parked outside the courthouse, reporters ambushing Claire and Karen whenever they appeared. Some questioned Claire's motives, suggesting she'd orchestrated the whole thing for fame or money. Others painted her as a hero, the brave wife who exposed a killer. The truth felt messier than any of those stories. Claire didn't feel like a hero. She felt like someone who'd wandered into a horror movie and couldn't find her way out. The nightmares came every night. Dreams where she was Rachel, where Tom's hands were around her throat, where she was the one buried somewhere, waiting to be found. The police searched 3 locations based on the dates and coordinates in Tom's notebook. They found nothing, but the searches were ongoing. 2 other cold cases from nearby counties were reopened, the similarities too striking to ignore. One morning, as Claire reviewed her testimony again, Karen burst into the room with her phone. "They found her," she gasped, tears streaming down her face. "They found Rachel." A construction crew breaking ground for a new building had discovered remains in an old industrial area. The coordinates matched one of the entries in Tom's notebook. Dental records confirmed it was Rachel. Claire held Karen as she cried, feeling a strange mix of relief and devastation. Rachel would finally get a proper burial. Her family would have answers. But the reality of what Tom had done, what he was capable of, hit Claire with fresh horror. That night, unable to sleep, Claire wrote a letter to Rachel. She apologized for living in her house, for sleeping in her bed, for not discovering the truth sooner. She wrote about the kind of man they'd both loved and the monster hiding behind that love. When she finished, she felt something shift inside her, not healing exactly, but a step toward it. The trial would start in 3 days. Claire looked at herself in the bathroom mirror, touching the dark circles under her eyes. She didn't look like the same woman who'd found that box in the attic months ago. That woman had died somewhere along the way, replaced by someone stronger, someone who knew the price of truth and was willing to pay it. Would you like me to continue with Section 7? The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters when Claire arrived for the first day of the trial. Karen walked beside her, both women clutching coffee cups with shaking hands. They'd barely slept, spending the night going over old photos of Rachel, reminding themselves why they were here. Inside the courtroom, Tom sat at the defense table in an expensive suit, looking more like a corporate executive than a man accused of murder. He turned when Claire entered, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since his arrest. She forced herself to hold his gaze, refusing to look away first. The prosecution's opening statement laid out the story, like a puzzle being assembled. The financial fraud Tom had tried to hide, Rachel's discovery of the truth, the carefully planned murder, and decade-long cover-up. Claire watched the jury's faces as they learned about the blood evidence, the buried remains, the suspicious bank transfers. Tom's lawyer painted a different picture, a troubled marriage, a wife who'd threatened to leave, a husband who'd moved on and rebuilt his life. He suggested Claire had fabricated evidence out of jealousy, unable to accept that she wasn't Tom's first love. Claire's hands clenched in her lap as the defense lawyer described her as a woman desperate for attention and a failed second wife trying to destroy what's left of her husband's life. Karen squeezed her arm, grounding her. When Claire took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She felt Tom's eyes on her as she swore to tell the truth, but she didn't look at him. Instead, she focused on Rachel's photo on the prosecutor's table. She owed Rachel the truth. "Tell us about the day you found the photos," Sarah Chen prompted. Claire's voice grew stronger as she described everything. Finding the box, discovering Rachel's disappearance, uncovering the financial records. When she got to the confrontation in the garage, her hands started shaking. "He wasn't surprised," she said. "When he realized I knew about Rachel, he didn't act confused or upset. He just changed, like a mask falling off." Tom's lawyer tried to trip her up on cross-examination, suggesting she'd invented the whole story after finding out about Rachel's disappearance online. But Claire's bank records showed her discoveries in real time. The searches, the visits to Karen's bookstore, the careful gathering of evidence. The forensics team testified about the blood evidence, explaining how it matched Rachel's DNA. The financial investigators laid out Tom's complicated fraud scheme, showing how Rachel's planned expose would have ruined him. Karen's testimony brought several jurors to tears as she described the decades spent searching for her sister, never knowing she'd been buried less than 20 miles away. When Tom took the stand, he was charming, reasonable, confused by the whole situation. He suggested Rachel had threatened to expose him if he didn't pay her off. Said she'd probably run away with the money. Claimed Claire had planted evidence to frame him. But under cross-examination, his calm facade cracked. When Chun produced new evidence, a receipt for cement mix purchased the day after Rachel disappeared, Tom's face twisted with familiar rage. Claire watched several jurors lean back, recognizing the expression she'd seen in the garage. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Claire and Karen sat in a small conference room, neither speaking, both jumping every time footsteps passed the door. Finally, the bailiff called them back. Tom stood as the jury filed in, his shoulders straight, still playing the role of wronged husband. The foreman's voice was clear. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty." Karen burst into tears. Claire felt strangely hollow, watching as they led Tom away. He turned at the door, his eyes finding hers one last time. She saw no remorse there, only cold calculation. The real Tom, finally unmasked. Outside, reporters shouted questions about justice and closure. But Claire knew better. There was no real closure, not for a wound this deep. There was only truth, finally dragged into the light after a decade in darkness. Would you like me to continue with the final section? The house sold quickly, despite its history. Claire couldn't stand the thought of someone else living there, not knowing what had happened in that garage, so she made sure the new owners knew the whole story. They gutted the place, rebuilt it completely. Sometimes Claire drove past, wondering if Tom's secrets were still buried in those walls. She moved to a small apartment across town, close to Karen's bookstore. The two women had formed a bond that went beyond their shared trauma. Every Thursday, they had dinner together, talking about everything except Tom. Sometimes they talked about Rachel, sharing memories and what-ifs, but mostly they talked about the future. The media attention faded slowly. There were true crime podcasts, documentary requests, book deals offered. Claire turned them all down. She'd had enough of being the wife who caught a killer. She wanted to be just Claire again, though she wasn't sure who that was anymore. Therapy helped. Her counselor, Dr. Martinez, specialized in trauma and betrayal. "You're grieving multiple losses," she explained during one session. "The husband you thought you had, the life you planned, your sense of safety and trust. It's okay to mourn those things." Claire started volunteering at a domestic violence shelter, helping women spot the warning signs she'd missed. Some nights, sitting in support groups, she heard echoes of her own story in their voices, the subtle manipulations, the careful masks, the moment everything changed. The nightmares came less frequently now. She no longer jumped when her phone rang or checked her rearview mirror for following cars. But some habits stayed. She kept her important documents in a go bag by the door. She changed her locks every 6 months. She ran background checks on every new person in her life. A year after the trial, they finally held a proper funeral for Rachel. Karen had waited until the investigation was completely closed, until they could bury her sister with all the dignity she deserved. Claire stood with the family, feeling both out of place and exactly where she needed to be. Rachel's mother hugged her at the reception, holding her tight. "You gave us answers," she whispered. "You gave us peace." Claire wasn't sure about peace, but she understood the power of knowing, even when the truth hurt. The foundation they started in Rachel's name helped fund forensic accounting training for law enforcement. The idea was Karen's, using Rachel's story to help catch other financial predators before they turned violent. Claire served on the board, reviewing grant applications and sharing her experience with detective departments across the country. 2 other cold cases were reopened based on evidence found in Tom's papers. Claire testified at those trials too, watching families find the same bitter closure she'd helped give Rachel's. Tom got additional life sentences, though he never confessed, never showed remorse. One evening, sorting through old papers, Claire found the letter she'd written to Rachel before the trial. The words still rang true, the apology, the anger, the promise to expose the truth. She added a postscript. "You can rest now. He can't hurt anyone else." Claire dated occasionally, but carefully. She was upfront about her story, using it as a filter. Some men couldn't handle it, treating her like damaged goods. Others fetishized it, wanted to hear all the gory details. The right ones understood when she needed to take things slow, when she double-checked their stories, when she kept one eye on the exit. 5 years after the trial, Claire sat in Karen's bookstore, helping her sort through donations. They'd just finished planning that year's foundation fundraiser. A true crime podcast had recently featured Rachel's case, bringing renewed attention to their work. Do you ever wonder what your life would be like if you hadn't found that box? Karen asked, shelving a romance novel.
Claire thought about it.
Sometimes. But then I think about all the women we've helped, all the cases that got solved because of what we learned. Maybe this was always my path, you know? Maybe I was supposed to find those photos. Karen smiled, the same smile Claire had first seen in those wedding pictures, the one Rachel had shared. You know what Rachel would say about that? She'd say everything happens for a reason. Even the horrible things. Even the horrible things, Claire repeated, and for the first time, she almost believed it. That's the complete story, expanded to include all sections with natural transitions and consistent character development throughout. Would you like me to review any particular section or aspect of the story?
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.